What you're looking at are the original Hebrew scrolls, the Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, the texts that form the Hebrew Bible. Look closely. Nobody named Yeshua, nobody dying on a cross, walking on water, feeding 500, or leading 12 disciples appears in these scrolls. Every story you've been told from the Bible was written later, decades after the fact, in translations. People love to say Jesus comes from Yeshua, but nobody by that name existed in the original text. This is the original text, raw, untouched, and powerful, and it shows the truth. The Jesus you've been taught never existed here. Greek Christian texts, what you're looking at on the screen, were the ones who created the story of Jesus, written decades after the period they claim to describe by Greek-speaking Jews and early Christian converts. Greek is a European language, and these writers are the ones who crafted the narrative. There is no evidence of a person named Yeshua performing miracles, feeding 500, walking on water, dying on a cross, or leading 12 disciples. Those characters are not historically documented. They took a common Jewish name, Yeshua, and rendered it in Greek as Jesus. Note the I, because the letter J didn't exist yet. Latin translations later made it Jesus, and English translations centuries later gave us Jesus, a language that did not exist at the time the story was first written. All the miracles, disciples, and events described in the Gospels were written decades later, likely shaped by oral tradition and theological goals, not eyewitness accounts. The Hebrew scrolls, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, make no mention of this person. The historical evidence shows the Jesus you've been taught is a European creation built on translation, oral storytelling, and centuries of interpretation. What you're looking at on the screen is Europe's first widely used Bible, the Latin Vulgate. Every story you've been taught about Jesus started in Greek Christian texts, then was translated into this European Bible. The Greek stories shaped names, miracles, and disciples, feeding 500, walking on water, the 12 disciples, all born from Greek storytelling, and then carried into Europe through Latin translation. Europeans at that time did not speak English. Latin was the language of the church and the educated. When Latin started to fade as the dominant language, the Wycliffe Bible in the 1380s brought the Bible into English for the first time, but literacy was still limited, and the stories were already shaped by centuries of translation from Greek to Latin. So, when Christians say Christianity started in Africa, or claim it's not European, they haven't done the research. The truth is clear. The Jesus narrative we know is a European creation, born from Greek texts, carried through Latin, and finally rendered in English centuries later. The original Hebrew scrolls say nothing. It was all translation, invention, and storytelling. What you're looking at is the Wycliffe Bible, the first complete English translation of the Bible, 1380s. Before this, the Latin Vulgate was the standard Bible in Europe. Latin wasn't for the people. It was the language of the church, the elites, and the educated. Ordinary Europeans couldn't read it. It was a language of power and control, keeping knowledge in the hands of the few. English was the language of the common people, the land, the laborers, the majority, often dismissed as a slave language by those in power. The Wycliffe Bible translated the Latin Vulgate into English, finally giving the people access. But even here, the Wycliffe Bible did not use the name Jesus. In Wycliffe's English, the name appears as Jesus, a direct carryover from the Latin Isus, which itself came from the Greek Isus. The stories, walking on water, feeding 500, the crucifixion, the disciples, were already centuries old, crafted in Greek Christian texts and carried through translation. The Jesus we think we know, a European creation, born in Greek texts, molded in Latin, and finally presented in English as Jesus for the common people centuries after the story was invented. Now we enter the King James Bible, 1611, the moment the name Jesus as we know it was officially created in English. The translators weren't inventing a new story. They were working from the Greek Christian texts through centuries of Latin translation and the earlier Wycliffe Bible, which used Jesus. By 1611, English had evolved, and the King James translators rendered Jesus as Jesus, standardizing the name for all English-speaking Christians. This wasn't a historical person appearing in real time. This was a European creation, a name and narrative shaped over centuries for European audiences. Every story you associate with Jesus, the miracles, the disciples, the crucifixion, had been crafted in Greek texts, molded in Latin, and then translated into English. The King James Bible didn't discover Jesus. It gave the final European form to the story, cementing the name and the narrative that millions would accept as truth for centuries. Next chapter, 1619, Virginia. Now we're still in the European timeline. The King James Bible was published in 1611 in England. 8 years later, 1619, a ship arrives in Virginia carrying about 20 Africans. This moment marks the beginning of recorded African presence in English North America. At this time, there were no established slave systems, like what would later develop into full racial chattel slavery. That system would harden over decades through laws passed in the 1600s, but 1619 becomes symbolic, the beginning of a new chapter in American history. So understand the timeline. 1611, the King James Bible standardizes the name Jesus in English. 1619, the first recorded Africans arrive in Virginia. 1600s, English colonial laws begin shaping racial slavery. We are still in a European colonial framework. English power, English law, English religion, English expansion. The Bible in English spreads, colonies expand, systems of labor and control develop. This is not random history. This is a timeline. Keep this in mind. In 1619, when those first Africans arrived in Virginia, they did not speak English. They did not know the English Bible. They did not know the English version of Jesus from the 1611 King James Bible. They came from diverse African nations with their own languages, spiritual systems, cosmologies, and sacred traditions. They had their own names for the Creator, their own understanding of the divine, their own ancestral knowledge. The English language was foreign to them. The English Bible was foreign to them. The English religious structure was foreign to them. And over time, through colonial systems, English law, and plantation culture, Christianity in its English form became imposed and institutionalized. That's the historical shift. Next chapter, the plantation. The plantation was not just land, it was structure. It was control wrapped in routine. Many enslaved Africans arrived with their own languages, cosmologies, and ancestral names for the Creator. On the plantation, English was enforced. Native languages were suppressed. Families were separated. Culture was intentionally fractured. This is also where many first encountered Christianity in its English form. Plantations often held religious services, sometimes in chapels, sometimes in open yards, where enslaved people were taught about the English version of Jesus and God. Passages about obedience were emphasized, submission was preached, literacy was restricted so interpretation stayed controlled, religion became part of the system. But here's what complicates the story. Enslaved people did not simply erase their ancestral beliefs. They remembered. They carried fragments of West and Central African spiritual systems, reverence for ancestors, belief in spirit realms, sacred rhythms, call and response worship, communal prayer structures. In many cases, they merged what they were being taught with what they already knew. Some saw parallels, some renamed, some layered meanings beneath the surface. Christian language became the outer shell. Ancestral memory often remained underneath. This blending wasn't passive acceptance, it was survival. It was adaptation under pressure. In hush harbors, in the woods at night, away from overseers, worship looked different than what was presented in daylight. Spirituals carried coded meanings. Biblical stories of Exodus became liberation theology. The faith was reshaped through lived experience. The plantation tried to control bodies. It tried to filter belief. It tried to regulate identity. But belief is harder to dominate than labor. What was planted was trauma. What survived was memory. And systems echo long after chains are removed, not because people were programmed, but because structures leave psychological and cultural imprints across generations. That is the deeper, more complex truth. Next chapter, identity and erasure. When Christians say Christianity started in Africa, they are usually referring to regions like Ethiopia and parts of North Africa where Christianity existed very early. But most of the Africans brought to English North America in the 1600s came from West and Central Africa, regions where Christianity was not the dominant religion at the time. The majority of those enslaved Africans did not arrive speaking English. They did not arrive reading the King James Bible. They did not arrive calling on the English name Jesus. They came with their own languages, their own spiritual systems, their own names for the Creator. On plantations, English became the language of survival. African languages were heavily suppressed. Enslavers often separated people from the same ethnic group specifically to prevent unified communication. In some colonies and periods, laws and punishments discouraged the use of African languages and cultural practices. Severe punishment, including whipping, was used to enforce control. Christianity in the English colonies was frequently taught within the plantation system. Religious instruction often emphasized obedience and hierarchy. Many enslaved people encountered Protestant Christianity in this environment for the first time. Over time, English became the dominant language among enslaved communities because it was necessary for survival within the colonial system. Names were also altered. Enslaved people were often assigned first names by enslavers. After emancipation, many adopted the surnames of former enslavers or chose new surnames entirely because legal systems required fixed last names. That is why many African Americans today carry European surnames, not because those were their ancestral names, but because slavery disrupted original naming systems. The erasure of language and names was part of the structure of slavery. That is why today many descendants speak English as a first language. That is why ancestral African languages were largely lost in English America. That is why original surnames were disrupted. Not because identity didn't exist, but because the plantation system reshaped it under force. That is the historical reality.